Um, awesome. It's so nice to be here with all of you, and thanks to Dan for inviting me to speak. It's fun to see everyone's faces in real life after many years of Zooms. So, as he said, I'm a reporter with The Wire China. We're a weekly magazine, and we focus on China's global impact on business, trade, tech, and the environment. And I've covered a whole range of different things within that, things like semiconductors and cryptocurrency and engine technology. But one of the main themes for the work that I do is, as Dan mentioned, is the way in which the US business community interacts with China, and how that interaction relates to US government policy around national security or human rights or US-China tech competition. And it's an interesting moment to be doing that work because there's just so much scrutiny on the ways in which the US business community interacts with China. And every day there's a new media report or a new sanctions list announced around different things, but there's just so much scrutiny and pressure for the US business community to, for example, divest from things associated to human rights in Xinjiang or related to military buildup or US competitiveness with China. So we're at a very fascinating moment. And at the same time as there's so much scrutiny, there's also kind of an information vacuum. So it's harder and harder to know what's happening on the ground in China, particularly for the business community, but also for governments and for journalists like me. I'm based in DC and I cover a lot of China-related issues. And I think part of that information vacuum is due to, China is a complex environment. It's very different than the US. So for a US business, it's hard to know who your business partners are or who, like the implications of your investments in China. But it's also, I think, COVID has accelerated this information problem. There are very few people going back and forth. There are very few journalists that are in China from America. So this has kind of, on the one hand, there's a lot of scrutiny. On the other hand, there's not a lot of transparency. So today I'm going to talk about an investigation that I did this year that is a really good way into these themes that I've been talking about. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of new ways that people are finding to get information about China. If you're based in DC or you're based in other places, there's a lot you miss. But what are the ways that people are using to get information? So this is the story that I'm going to talk about. It's called The Surveillance State, and a little bit about how it came to be. So someone came to us at The Wire China this year, this winter, and said that they believed that KKR, which is the second largest private equity firm in the world, it's one of the premier private equity firms, very famous, very prestigious. They owned a company in China that was developing surveillance technology alongside the Ministry of Public Security. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the Ministry of Public Security is, a government agency in China, does policing work, but it's also been a key cog in the Chinese domestic surveillance state. So if this was really true, if KKR did own a company doing this in an industry as sensitive as surveillance, surveillance has been a key focus of US government policy. There are major Chinese surveillance firms on sanctions lists, things like SenseTime, or they're famous, huge Chinese firms. So if a US owned company was doing this, that would be pretty remarkable. So we decided to take on our own investigation and figure out whether that was really true. So a little bit of background on the Chinese company at the center of this whole story. It was called, or it is called Q Group, and it was started in 2017 by KKR as a digital marketing firm. So it was not only invested in by KKR, it was actually 4 companies that KKR merged together to create, and they were going to do mostly like optimizing digital marketing for companies like Alibaba or Tencent. And the CEO is a man named Shir Khan. You can see him on the company jet up there and also right in the middle here. And he has an interesting background. He was born in China, educated in China, then went to the US, worked at a US cloud computing firm, and then came back to China and had kind of a freewheel, lots of different Chinese companies that he had started. So he had 20 companies where he was an executive, and I think 10 more companies where he had a majority stake. So he had his hands full, and he started Q Group. So in terms of the reporting process, we had to figure out, first, did Q Group collaborate with the Ministry of Public Security? Second, we wanted to understand what was the ownership of Q Group. So what percent ownership did KKR have of Q Group at the time of the collaboration, but also currently? And then we wanted to look at the US pension funds that were investing in Q Group. So through KKR, what US pension funds were kind of investing in it to make its work happen. So this is the machine kind of at the center of the story. It's called the Q all-in-one machine. And this was the surveillance technology that we believed was done in collaboration with MPS. And as you can see, it has 2 different functions. It's facial recognition, but also it's temperature recognition. So it was created at the onset of COVID to do kind of dual functions. And this happened alongside kind of a transformation in Q Group. So Q Group was a digital marketing firm, but they decided to pivot towards more surveillance type projects at the onset of the COVID pandemic. This is kind of as an aside, that's kind of a broader transformation. China has always been, a pretty surveillance-focused place, but COVID really accelerated that trend. And there's a great new book about that by 2 Wall Street Journal reporters called The Surveillance State, which I really recommend to any of you who are interested in that broader trend. But so this is the Q all-in-one machine, and according to their marketing advertisements for it, it could be used, you put it at a front of a building or a front of a residential compound, and it can be used to screen COVID, but also they say that it can prevent kind of mass gathering, or it can block specific blacklisted people. So there's kind of dual functions going on here. And in terms of understanding whether the collaboration happened, the first thing we did was we went on the Q Group website. And on the website, it said, we created this alongside the Ministry of Public Security. So it's actually pretty easy to find that. And it was not only the Ministry of Public Security, it was also this company, Zhuhai Zhongduan, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Q Group. So them together, they were collaborating alongside this Ministry of Public Security lab. So we had the confirmation on their website, and then we reached out to the Ministry of Public Security lab. And usually as an American journalist, you reach out to a Chinese government agency or person, and you very rarely expect a response. But soon after, we got an email back saying, yes, we did collaborate with Q Group, which was kind of amazing from a reporting perspective, because we had confirmation from both the company and the Ministry of Public Security lab. So just a little background on the lab itself, so you could understand why it's important that a KKR-owned firm would be doing this. It's called the Zhuhai Innovation Center. It was opened in 2019, and it was started to develop video and AI tech for public security applications. And it was under the MPS First Research Institute, which is a research arm of MPS. And the director overseeing it from Beijing, just to give you a sense of the individuals involved, was a longtime public security official who formerly was deputy director of public security for the XPCC, which is, for those of you who don't know it, it's a huge kind of paramilitary conglomerate in Xinjiang, highly sanctioned by the US government. So just to give you a sense of the individuals involved. And this is actually from a Chinese press report, and this is Shi Khan, the CEO of Q Group, and he's at the opening of the lab. So that just gives you a sense of kind of his involvement, I guess. So that's the lab, and we reached out to human rights experts, surveillance experts, whole range of different people to say, what would it mean for a KKR-owned firm to do this? And they all said this would be a huge red flag, something that potentially they wouldn't want to be doing and being involved with. And so then we had to understand what the ownership was from KKR. So we looked through, there were multiple different layers of corporate ownership. So it was first in China, second, there was a Singapore holding group, third, there was a Cayman Islands group. And through all of that, we determined that they were the majority owner until 2021, which is after this collaboration happened. They sold off in 2021 to be a minority owner. Unclear why they decided to do that. So we reached out to KKR and Q Group, and they both deny any MPS collaboration. So it's important to note that. But after we reached out, this is a screenshot of a reference to the collaboration on the website. They deleted it immediately. So this is a week apart. The yellow line is what describes the collaboration. You can see a week later, it's gone. So they're quickly distancing themselves from any association, and they're also denying any collaboration. And they're also saying that they're primarily a digital marketing firm. So that was their big argument to us. You know, we help companies do digital marketing. We do not do surveillance. But as recently as the summer before we published this piece, they made a $15 million investment, I believe, in this autonomous vehicle startup, which was marketed as a public safety surveillance tool. This is a video from their LinkedIn. It's kind of interesting because this is the vehicle itself. This is kind of a scene that they were describing that they could catch. So this is like a person, I guess, being kidnapped. And so it's saying that the vehicle can catch that as it's walking or driving around. And here, I think it's interesting to think about why would Q Group pivot from being more of a digital marketing firm to being more of a surveillance firm. And that's where kind of the incentives for the Chinese company and the incentives for the American private equity firm are very different. Because for the Chinese firm, if they partner with the Ministry of Public Security, they can potentially get access to huge amounts of data. You know, partnering with the government could allow that. I spoke to a professor here at Harvard about this, David Yang, who said that, you know, that's a really big incentive point for a small firm to be partnering with the government. Also, as I mentioned before, surveillance was such a hot industry at the onset of COVID. So for them, it could make perfect sense to decide to get involved with that. But for KKR, the incentive is incredibly different because it carries huge reputational risk for an American firm like that to be associated with something like this. Then we looked at the pension fund investment. So this gives you a sense of kind of how interconnected the US economy and US financial system is with a small digital marketing firm in China. So they were major pension funds like the New York State Common Retirement Fund or the California State Teachers Retirement System. They were putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the KKR fund that owns Q Group. And we reached out to all of these pension funds. We said, we think one of the investments in the KKR fund is collaborating with MPS. Do you have a comment on that? All of them did not want to comment on the story except for one, which is the 500 million investment one, so Washington State Investment Board. And this is a broader trend than just KKR and Q Group. A lot of US pension funds and VC and private equity firms have put money into prominent Chinese surveillance companies like SenseTime, which is a hugely sanctioned Chinese firm. And so that, again, gives you a sense of kind of how interconnected these systems really are. And then I want to talk about kind of the policy theme that was overlaying this piece. So right now, the US government has no tool to screen this type of outbound investment. So when KKR, a US firm, decides to invest in a Chinese firm that ends up doing this, the US government has no way to screen it. And this is a big policy debate right now that's happening in Washington. Should the US government screen this? We have screening on the other way. So if a Chinese firm is investing here in the US, there's a body under the Treasury Department called CFIUS that screens whether it could be a national security risk. So there's a famous example of a Chinese tech firm trying to buy Grindr, the gay dating app. And the US government decided, no, we can't let that happen because that would be a national security risk to allow the data to be provided to the Chinese firm. So we have inbound screening, but when it comes to outbound, we have no screening. And this outbound investment screening was included in the original China competition legislation, which passed this summer. It ended up being taken out, but it's still this huge debate in Washington. And there was a letter that got sent to Biden, as I think last month, by a huge group of lawmakers, including Pelosi, that said, we really need to do this. Jake Sullivan has said this would be helpful. But I think it's still pretty controversial because, first of all, it would require a huge amount of manpower. How do you look at all of the investment that is happening from the US to China? How do you define the parameters of what would be sensitive, what would not be sensitive? Because you wouldn't want to screen every single investment, right? That would just require too much. So how do you do it in a way that's smart? And then also, I mean, do we want to do it is the other kind of fundamental question. And this is kind of gets to the broader question of decoupling and how much do we really want to separate the US and Chinese economies. We saw last week there was a huge chip export restriction that was passed by the US government that basically just segments the US and Chinese semiconductor supply chains. And that's a really good example of kind of decoupling in action. This would be another measure that would do a similar kind of segmenting off. So I want to step back again and talk a little bit about the information vacuum question that I referenced earlier. This idea of how it's really hard to get information out of China, whether you're KKR trying to understand whether Q Group is doing something in China, or whether you're the US government trying to figure something out, or whether you're me, a reporter in DC. It's just really hard to understand when you can't be on the ground and understand what's happening. And so this theme comes up again and again in reporting that I've done and reporting that The Wire does. And so I just want to reference a few examples because it shows you how this manifests. One example is a story my colleague Elliot Chen did, which is an amazing story. You should all read it. That traces the supply chain of actually specifically dates that come from XPCC, which is the paramilitary conglomerate in Xinjiang I mentioned earlier. It comes from XPCC all the way to US grocery stores. And it's not allowed in the US. Those products are banned, but they still end up here. And how does that happen? I think primarily it's because if you're a customs border agent at the New York port, it's really hard to understand, where is this date coming from? And that's, they're coming from a different port, or they're relabeled, or they're holding companies. And so again, it's just the information vacuum in action. The other story I wanted to mention is I did a piece actually about the journalist community and how during COVID, there was a huge expulsion of US reporters from China. There have been many cases of US reporters being kicked out of China before this, but the Trump administration decided to kick out Chinese reporters from the US. And as a result, China kicked out American reporters from China. And so the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they all got kind of wiped out. And that, again, leads to more information challenges because businesses and governments, they rely on journalists to understand what's happening. And so not having journalists on the ground, and unfortunately, Chinese journalists often cannot do the politically sensitive issue oriented reporting. So it, again, adds to this question of how do we know what's happening? And then I wrote a piece about Eskel, which is a textile firm founded by someone named Marjorie Yang. And she kind of staked her reputation on being socially responsible and having good labor standards. But she was put on a sanctions list here in the US, the entity list, for labor violations in Xinjiang. She maintained that, she and also her company maintained that there were no labor violations. She was completely, this was a company that was known to be good to its employees, but there were not auditors on the ground in Xinjiang. It's really hard to do auditing there. They're not, the people who made the entity list could not go and ask the workers. And so again, it's just this question of how do businesses operate when the information is so limited? And then I don't want to be all doom and gloom, so I want to talk a little bit about the ways that people have been creative about new ways to get information out. And I did a piece actually focused solely on this this year called Open Source, where I profiled all the people that, given not being able to be in China, what are new methods and new kind of source material that we can use to find out more. And one is satellite imagery. So satellite imagery has been used in a lot of creative ways recently. There's a Pulitzer Prize winning investigation that BuzzFeed did using satellite imagery to determine kind of the size and capacity of detention camps in Xinjiang. And that was hugely impactful. And that was all done remotely using satellite imagery. Another method is just using Chinese government websites. This seems basic, but there's a lot of information out there that can be accessed if you know where to look. And this piece looked at a researcher named Adrian Zenz, who has used a lot of government websites to understand different policy choices in Xinjiang. So that's a huge source and an underutilized source. Patent filings is another good example. So if you looked at the MPS lab I was talking about earlier, if you looked at what patents they were filing, it could be a good indication of what tech they were prioritizing. That's a good example. Chinese government tenders. So, you know, when something needs to happen, the government puts out an open bid. You know, we want XXX, and that's a good indication of what the government is doing. So there was a Georgetown researcher who used government tenders to understand the military's use of AI. And that was all from the government saying, we need this, this, this. And a lot of people have used open bids in interesting ways. And then corporate records is another one. That's one that I use a lot in my reporting. It's relatively easy to get information out about who owns a company, who's on the board of a company, those types of things, and that can tell you a lot. So if an SOE, if a state-owned enterprise owns a company, what does that mean? Or a certain political person owns a company, what does that mean? And the person who runs and started The Wire, David Barboza, he's kind of a pioneer in using these, and he wrote about Wen Jiabao's family wealth by just tracking, not just, but really using corporate records to understand what holdings the family had. So these are ways in which actually there's a lot out there if you know where to look, and people are having to be more creative, people like me, but also governments and businesses. And then I just want to say at the end, I'm about to publish a big investigation, hopefully this weekend, that is kind of an exemplification of all the things that I've been talking about. I hope you all can read it. It's really about an American company understanding who their Chinese business partners are, and the huge implications of that. So if you just boil it down, that's what it's about. And in order to figure that out, in order to figure out who those Chinese business partners were, I looked at different varying source materials that I've talked about. You know, I had to look at land records in Hong Kong and identification documents and Panama records, Chinese blogs. It runs the gamut. So it was a good case study of how you have to be creative, and also kind of the broader themes around how hard it is for US businesses to understand what's happening. So that's all for me, and I really appreciate your time and look forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Katrina. That was great. I've learned a lot from your writing, so it was great to hear you in person. We'll go to audience questions in a moment, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first one or two. I would just start by saying I was struck. You know, you mentioned there's a lot of information out there, and I was thinking to myself, there's a lot of information out there if you read Chinese.
Yes,
right.
True.
So I do think that's a complicating factor in a lot of cases. But I wanted to ask about the review of outbound investments. So I think this would be, according to what I know, the first time in U.S. history there would be such a review. And it feels to me there's two. Everybody wants to do something about it, but they don't quite know what. And it seems to me there's two complications. The first is that we sometimes only see the application of these technologies in retrospect. Right, even with Q, you pointed out that they started off as facial and temperature recognition, which seems innocuous enough if you're looking at COVID things, but also companies develop, right? So it can be hard to predict in the future what might be a sensitive technology. And then the other thing is, it seems to me, and I've read others who've brought this up, right? It's only effective if you get your allies on board to a certain extent, because if you're restricting these investments, but others are just making them in your stead, then it's not effective. So maybe you can comment on that, and then we will go to the audience. So after Katrina's had a chance to answer, feel free to raise your hand, and if you want to point to people, I'll pass the mic. But maybe you can take that one first.
Yeah, I think the outbound investment challenge is is hard because we thought about this in this piece. Even if we had outbound investment screening, would the US government have screened a KKR investment in Q Group? Probably not, because it was a digital marketing firm. So how do you know, it's almost impossible. It's like a needle in a haystack, almost figuring out what could be problematic and what couldn't be. So I definitely do not have the answer. That's for the smarter people in Washington. And I think it's an open question whether it even will be enacted, because it would be the first time in history that a country anywhere does this type of thing. So it would require a lot of finessing and also probably a lot of trial and error. It would probably go wrong for a few years before it went right. Yeah, that's.
I would just say it seems like that would have headwinds for the U.S. economy. And as
Yeah,
I
for
understand the
sure.
Corn and Casey bill, it's country specific.
Yeah.
Right. So it wouldn't be all such outbound investment, but rather those focused on China or a group of countries, including China.
Countries of concern.
Countries of concern. Yes. If you want to point people out, Katrina, I'll pass the mic. Yes.
Hello, I'm Hagen from South Korea. I'm an MPP2 student here. I just wanted to ask you about the question of finding the right information with the right language. A lot of times when you just look up into Baidu, it's not enough. Like their search filter is pretty messed up, I'll say, compared to Google, but even Google does not provide you with enough information to find clues, especially when it comes to China. I think that's the same struggle that you find. So what I found interesting is that what you do is pretty much what military intelligence or intelligence agents would do, going through satellite images and stuff. But I was just wondering, how do you find clues to your research or article topics in the first place? And then how do you get around the internet to find the right information at the right time when the search engine is not so available?
Yeah. I also find, I think I always search in both Baidu and Google, and you get different things in both. So it's always interesting to see what comes up in Google and what comes up in Baidu. On the piece that I was speaking about that's coming out soon, I had been researching these people in China for months. And I had been, looking at every possible source material. And then one day I was looking, I think it was on Baidu, and just playing around with different search terms. And then all of a sudden, this website that had a wealth of information for me popped up. And this was 3 months into reporting about this. I was like, how did I not see this earlier? So I think it's just time. I think it's just trying every possible combination. And oftentimes the combination is what helps you. And sometimes it's Chinese and English, or Chinese, or English. It's just it takes time, I would say. And then in terms of story ideas, they kind of come from all different places. Sometimes it's people who come and say, you really should do a story about this. Sometimes it's a previous piece that I had done, kind of leads me on to a next piece. And then sometimes I often read articles, and like, a Wall Street Journal article, for example, and there's a little tidbit at the end that makes me question something, and then I try to blow up that tidbit into a story.
And I just have to jump in. So do places like KKR have people doing the same thing? Looking in, are there?
I think so.
Okay.
I would hope so.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm also from South Korea. I don't want to give the impression that South Koreans are dominating this discussion, which is actually true. But I just want to ask you a human question. I mean, those people who work for KKR, they are well-educated people, who go to KKR. Probably some of people who graduate from schools, institutions like this school, right? And and then they do these things. And we have also histories about Cisco also providing surveillance technology to China many years ago. We also know the famous stories about Goldman Sachs expanding its business, some of them very immoral businesses in China. So the symbiotic relationship between American elite group with the Chinese, I mean, then already at the beginning of conversation that it's kind of winding down. But where do you see this relationship between American elite business group with China? Is it going? Is it coming to an end? Or what's the current situation today? Thank you.
It's a big question. I think it's definitely changing, as Dan said at the very beginning. The dynamic is so different today because of what I mentioned earlier, the scrutiny that's there. It's just a different level of attention that's being placed on national security in the US or human rights, or it's front and center. It's on the front pages of newspapers all the time. So I don't think that it's the same as 10 years ago, but I also think that there's so much money at stake, and China is still such a huge market for so many businesses that I don't think it's changing as fast as some people think it is. Still, when you talk to companies, US companies, about China, it's very different than the discourse you get in other places in the US kind of conversation. It's a totally different narrative. So yes, it's changing, but I think it's still a huge draw for US companies.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. My name is Michael from Harvard College, and I got one question regarding why is the Chinese government so interested in decreasing the amount of information published? Because I was in a lecture from the one you mentioned before, David Yang, who mentioned that actually the amount of economic statistics published per year decreased heavily by almost like 70–80% over the last couple of years. So like on one side that leads to some disadvantages and some advantages because you have like more information asymmetry, but then national security reasons. So what do you think is the main reason for them publishing less, more and more?
I don't know. I don't know what's in the minds of the Chinese government. There was recently, they delayed their GDP numbers, and everyone kind of freaked out because there were, why were they delaying their GDP numbers? Probably because they weren't super good, but we don't know. But I think this is a good example. They don't want American governments and American journalists or other people digging into these types of things, and it's more of a risk for them than it is a positive. What are they getting out from putting so much out there? But I would push back a little bit because I think there still is so much out there. If you know where to look, and if you speak Chinese, I spoke to a researcher at Berkeley for the open source piece, and he was just describing how if you have such a massive digitized country, he described it as digital exhaust that was going to come off the country. Like there's so much out there that maybe wasn't intended to be out there, but it is. So even as we have less statistics maybe out there and less transparency, there's still stuff there.
Katrina, it seems to me too that to have a high functioning economy, there's people within China who just want to invest for normal, non-sensitive reasons, who need that information easily accessible. So should we go to the back?
Sorry.
Hello, I'm Jenny. I'm an MPP1 student from China, and I have a question about journalism and reporting. So you mentioned there are like a wide variety of open sources that you use. So how do you actually verify the authenticity of these sources? And I also have a Chinese friend who works as a news assistant for this British newspaper in Beijing. She was reporting on one of the stories, and she got contacted by the police. Her parents got contacted by the police. So I understand like the human level of reporting and interviews are very important. But right now, the US or any foreign agency don't really have this kind of resource. So how does specifically the Wire China mitigate this barrier? And then the second question is, so do you see that China kicking out foreign journalists as response to specific American journalists as response to the US kicking out Chinese journalists? And how do you foresee this to change in the future? And how does the Wire China prepare for that future?
Good questions. So first, the first verification question, I think it's again a question of just doing more work. So you can't just use one Chinese website or one piece of information to say that something is happening. You always want to, even if they won't pick up the phone, you always want to be making the calls and trying to reach the people involved, and not just relying on open source stuff. And that's kind of that's a critical part of journalism, you know, like talking to real people. So I think I don't want to say that this is the only thing that people should be relying on. I would hope that they would also be interviewing people and doing that hard work as well. So verification just comes from looking more places and getting many evidence points. Your second question, yeah, I mean, the challenge for a lot of US news organizations is that a lot of the bureaus for a long time relied on Chinese news assistants because obviously they have language and they're often brilliant reporters themselves. They're called news assistants, but really they're reporters. But it puts them at such a risk. And now today, even more of a risk. There was a Bloomberg reporter, Chinese national, who was detained, and it's a tougher environment now for those news assistants, and that's so scary for your friend and your friend's family to have to go through that. So, in terms of what started the journalist expulsion, I think. The precipitating factor immediately was the Trump kicking out of Chinese reporters in the US. And I would argue that was kind of a silly decision because why the Trump administration thought that they were kind of acting as spies or something. And maybe they are, but we gain a lot from having US reporters in China. And I think that should outweigh any decision to kick out Chinese reporters. Obviously, the Trump administration disagreed with me. So the Wire, we don't have a presence in China, and we probably won't. And that's sad because there's so much that you miss from not being there, and I wish that I could be there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Katrina. I think that this is a place that we're always trying to understand better, China, and the work that you're doing both at the Wire China and through all of your writing has been incredibly valuable. It's been a great conversation. I hope you'll be available to stay around for a few minutes afterwards if people want to come up and talk to you. But please, everyone, join me in welcoming Katrina. Thanking Katrina. Thank you, Katrina.